Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Let's get started. Good morning and welcome to The Call, brought to you by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington. I'm your host, Jay Sapsford, and here is today's question of the moment. How will a showdown over Ukraine reshape the global balance of power? 3 years after Russia invaded its neighbor, the war is approaching a significant turning point. On Tuesday, President Trump sent a high-level U.S. delegation to Riyadh to engage in negotiations with their Russian counterparts. So far, Europe and Ukraine have been left on the sidelines, and tensions are boiling. This diplomatic row raises a series of questions with broader implications for the region. Will the snub be enough to kickstart European defense spending? How might a stronger Europe shift strategic alliances? Does Europe have the money or the time to defend Ukraine alone? And what does this moment say about the state of great power rivalries? Today's guest will help address these questions, and we are honored to have with us Dr. Alina Polyakova, the CEO and President of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Alina, welcome to The Call.
Thanks for having me, Jay. Look forward to it.
So you were on the ground in Munich at the Munich Security Council over the weekend. How do you assess the reaction of the European leaders to the U.S. overtures to Russia?
Well, certainly, if the U.S. administration was looking for shock and awe, they got it in Munich. I was in the room when Vice President Vance delivered his speech, which many Europeans expected to have key announcements about changes in U.S. security and force presence in Europe. Of course, the Vice President didn't address all of that. But certainly just a few days before the German elections, being on the ground in Germany and making a very clear call for a certain kind of political alignment of the U.S. with Germany's AfD, one of the main opposition right-leaning parties, came as a shock. And the rest of the conversations really centered around what is the direction of travel for U.S. policy vis-a-vis the peace deal in Ukraine. And of course, it's only been a few days, but we've learned a huge amount of where the White House is now heading.
So as we move from a multipolar world or from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, isn't this a tacit admission by the United States that it can no longer set the entire agenda for the world, and that it has to disengage to some extent from the role it used to play in the recent past?
No, it's really hard, I think, to gauge right now where the United States is heading in terms of the broader vision. I think we can speak to what the negotiations that are being pursued right now between the U.S. and Russia are. But I think there's long-term implications if we keep going the direction of what looks like increasing U.S. retrenchment, if you will. We just heard about potential cuts in our defense budget at the same time as we are facing greater global threats emanating in all of the theaters where we have some of our core alliances, including in Europe, of course, Indo-Pacific, and potentially we're looking at other threat vectors reemerging in the Middle East again, the global South. It is a world on fire. And right now, if the U.S. retrenches, which certainly looking like that's the trend, we will find ourselves in a much more dangerous, uncertain, and vulnerable position, I think, in the medium and long term.
Alina, I wonder, can Europe defend Ukraine on its own?
The answer right now is no. There's been massive divestment in Europe's defense industrial base for decades. European countries, for the most part, with a few exceptions, have ended conscription, for example, which many of them had for decades after the end of the Second World War. Europe cannot produce or ramp up production of either the basic needs of war, like ammunition, tanks, light armored vehicles, nor the highly advanced, exquisite weapon systems that, of course, the U.S. produces so extremely well, but on very long timelines. And so we're looking at a major lag in capacity and a major lag in resources in terms of what Europe would actually need to do to defend Ukraine now and what it can do. So the political will, I think, is starting to grow, but there is just a basic question of how fast can you build ammunition factories? How quickly can you buy equipment? We know in our own defense industrial base, we have identified some key and quite profound problems in our ability to deliver to our allies, resupply allies. We are struggling to be able to do those things in the United States, and our companies have to rethink their structure and how they're working. But, it's no longer possible to have a 20-year or more timeline for producing a fighter jet or another exquisite weapon. I think we really have to start rethinking the structure of defense industrial base production. And Europe right now cannot go at it alone. That's very, very clear.
And I would imagine that situation is complicated by the fact that there seems to be at least some disunity among the member states of Europe. Now, I wonder if you can expound on that.
Well, of course, in the last 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, but even before that, we've seen, I think, a restructuring within Europe where we have the states of the Nords, the Balts, the eastern flank of NATO going down to Bulgaria and Romania, being very keenly aware of the problem, meaning the potential threat that they would face from Russian aggression if it goes beyond Ukraine. So you have countries like Poland now investing 5% of GDP into defense spending. The US is about 3.5% of GDP, and that's been actually declining over time. It looks like might decline again. And other countries like Lithuania, they're small countries, but they're also investing at that same level. And then the further west you go, or even south, countries like Italy, huge economic powers at the European level, but they're not even meeting their 2%, which is the NATO threshold, of course. So we see a huge discrepancy, I think, between the countries of the crescent, as I call them, which is UK, the Nords, Balts, all the way down to the Black Sea, and the rest of Europe, where we have a real vacuum and I think a real lack of investment, a real, I think, lack of just urgency, frankly, because Europe had opportunities to rebuild its defense industrial infrastructure now for a significant amount of time, and they haven't done it. And now everyone is panicking because it looks like the US may not be the backstop anymore. And it's going to take a long time for them to get there in the places where they haven't invested as much as countries like Poland and the others I mentioned.
If Europe is able to muster the political will, as you put it, to raise its defense spending, I would think that over the longer term, or even over the medium term, it could be pretty compelling, given that the European economy is 10 times that of Russia.
The money is there. There's no question about that. You know, at the last Leaders Summit the France hosted, the conversations began about where is the money going to come from. One obvious place that should have been done a while ago is, of course, to remove these very strict debt and borrowing ceilings that EU member states impose on themselves. So Germany, again, largest economy in Europe still, is struggling, but they can't borrow money beyond a very, very low percentage. The US, we do a lot with borrowed money. A lot of other countries do. If you unleash just the ability to get credit to invest in defense, that would be a sea change. That's one thing. I think the second thing the European leaders could have done is, of course, use the frozen Russian assets, around 300 billion or so that are just sitting as cash deposits now, making no money in various banks across Europe primarily. And they could have used that funding now to either provide weapons to Ukraine, economic assistance. Really, it's an open question there. But there's a real reality here where I think European countries, no matter which direction they go in now, have to find the short and medium term opportunities for defense investment. In my view, there's no better place to look than Ukraine. And we can keep talking about that if you'd like.
Okay, I would, but before I get to that, I first wanted to ask the question about stockpiles. You've mentioned all of this money. What are they going to buy if stockpiles have been so depleted because of the past 3 years of war in Ukraine and all the support that the West has been giving Kyiv?
That's a really important question because, of course, we don't know exactly how many systems and weapons the US has in its stockpiles. That information is rightfully not for public debate and open source information. But we know where European leaders have said that whatever stockpiles they had, which wasn't a lot, they are looking to the United States to resupply. At the same time as they're looking to the United States to supply the Ukraine's current war needs. And European stockpiles, as small as they were, as far as we know, are depleted. And they're now in these long queues to buy more systems. And we cannot provide them as the United States. So the question is, where are they going to look for these systems, weapons, et cetera? South Korea is playing an increasingly important part in that as an exporter of quite sophisticated systems. But that's also not going to be enough. I'm very concerned that given the tension we're now seeing between Europe and the United States on a variety of issues, the Europeans are going to increasingly start looking to China. And I'm not just saying that as a pie in the sky idea. These are real conversations that are happening. And of course, I think it's not in the US national security interest to suddenly see Europe really beholden to Chinese weapons imports. That comes with all kinds of, I think, concerns and questions about national security, interoperability at the NATO level. But that is my concern, that we're not thinking through the long-term implications of potentially removing ourselves as the United States as the key ally in defense and security, because we benefit from that a huge amount, especially our companies.
Well, to that point, one of our audience members is asking that, or noting that China and Russia have a deepening alliance, wondering is Trump's overtures to Russia an effort to lure Russia away from its alliance with China?
So this is the idea of the so-called reverse Kissinger strategy, which refers to the moment when Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State, managed to basically lure away China during the Soviet period away from the Soviet Union and isolate the Soviet Union more. We're in a very different environment now. You know, back then, the tensions between Russia and China were very obvious. There were ideological tensions, and I think it just took some very good diplomacy to be able to just intensify those divisions. We're not seeing that right now. If anything, Russia and China have grown much more powerful together, but it's also produced a real inequity in the relationship. You know, the Russians have very little to offer to the Chinese now, except inexpensive discounted oil and gas, as well as other natural resources, lumber, et cetera. But they're really a natural resource economy and a hydrocarbon economy. And the Chinese are benefiting to a huge amount. I think there's very little incentive for the Russians to break this relationship, because after the Russians were cut off from being able to export gas and mostly oil to Europe, which was their biggest market for a long time, they have rejiggered their export vectors, and they are exporting a lot more to China. The Chinese are helping them with technology. They're helping them with other component parts. They're buying Russian product. I think it's really an illusion and maybe even a delusion to think that we can undermine China by peeling Russia away at this point. I don't see any real potential in which that happens.
Now, you captured my imagination with your hint earlier that Ukraine itself could be a source of weaponry in the over the medium terms, perhaps, given all of its experience over the past. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, and particularly touch on this notion of these unmanned weapons that everyone seems to be like thinking about now in greater and greater extent.
So what's interesting is that the conversation that we didn't hear about in the news during the Munich Security Conference was exactly on this. Most of the conversations I had behind the scenes were about advancements in artificial intelligence and its uses on the battlefield. And Ukraine is testing the most innovative, cutting-edge technologies in theater right now. It's completely unprecedented, because what we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine is a strange combination of World War I type trench warfare with ammunition, tanks, and the things we think about when it comes to war, paired with quite sophisticated AI-driven drone capabilities that are increasingly becoming more and more autonomous in their ability to carry out and execute military missions. And that is happening because of the nature of war, also because electronic warfare has become far more sophisticated, signals can be jammed. So if we think about the old drone model where you had a piloted system, where a human would be sending a signal to the machine all the way until it hits its target, pushing the red button that says go, that has really disappeared from the battlefield. And we're looking at a much I think, more nuanced and complicated way in which autonomous systems are operating in Ukraine. And what I see is that the companies that are there now, Western companies, European American companies that are in theater, they are getting all the benefits of that innovation, and they're adopting and integrating that into their product, that they are then starting to really market cap based on that and compete with much, much larger companies, because these are really startups. And I mean, I can name a couple, but I don't want to name names here, that have grown exponentially in 3 years because they're benefiting so much from that innovation. So the big vision to my mind, and I think some Ukrainian companies see this, is if the Europeans get their act together, what is the cheapest, most effective way to build up your military defense and deterrence? Drones. not just in the airspace, in the naval domain, in the land domain. You can make them super cheap. You can buy them all now. The Ukrainians are making millions and millions of these things that battle ready and battle tested, and will provide an innovative edge to not just Europe, but all of NATO. So this is the vision that I think Europe can be thinking about. Ukraine can be an asset, not a vulnerability, when Europeans are thinking about how to build up fast their own defense capabilities.
Well, in order to seize on that opportunity, would Europe have to look at its own tech regulation and ease some of the barriers that it has entering these sort of new markets? I'm wondering, certainly the Draghi report of last year came out and noted that, regulation in Europe tends to be just punishingly thick. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that front.
So what's interesting is, of course, the EU AI Act, which is a big part of this conversation because it seeks to regulate AI, broadly speaking, does have a cutout for military applications. But that doesn't mean in any way that it's easy to do this kind of investment in Europe. In fact, it's really difficult. And European companies that are active in this space, well, guess what they're doing once they get above a certain level? They're coming to the United States and they're becoming American companies, which you could say is great for us, but it's not great for Europe. And it's not great for thinking about defense industrial base development. So certainly, what I would like to see Europe do now is really, just push pause on regulation. It is so heavy, it is so burdensome, it is killing Europe's ability to compete economically, not just militarily, but just broadly. It's affecting Europe's ability to have a dynamic economy, and we're seeing the signs of that struggle in every single European country. And also think about where they can start to actually pull back some of these heavy regulatory initiatives that they have implemented in just rapid fire over the last several years. So this is, I think, a moment of reflection. And I think European leaders are thinking about that. I was very heartened to see some of the discussions at the AI summit that took place right before the Munich Security Conference in France, where we had a completely different narrative. From Europe now, used to be very focused on risk and high risk in AI. And now all the conversation was about opportunity for innovation that AI can present, even if Europe cannot compete with our hyperscale companies, with large, sophisticated companies like NVIDIA, for example, and others in this space. But there are still revenues to be made. But that has to come with a pretty massive, I think, deregulatory move by the European Union in particular.
As we sum up here, it seems like we're entering an era in which, great powers have the final say on all of these agenda items around the world. And the ticket to entry of this is not soft power, it's not cultural balance, but it's going to be the ability to project power. And I wonder, can Europe become a player in this arena?
I think the basic foundations are there. The EU as a whole is a huge economy, as you mentioned. It is our most important trade partner in the United States. People forget that, how much, trillions and trillions of trade that we have with the EU on an annual basis. It is significant. We're invested across the Atlantic in incredibly meaningful long-term ways. So the foundations are there. The money can be found, they can borrow, there's all kinds of avenues in which countries can rejigger their budgets, but you really need leadership. And this is the biggest problem I see in Europe today, is that we have a leadership vacuum in France and Germany, which have been driving Europe for decades. And then we have the election coming up in Germany. It's likely we're not going to have a government for quite some time, just based on the current polling numbers. It's going to be paralysis. We have paralysis in France. The UK is out of the EU. They would have been a natural leader. So now we have Italy, which, as I mentioned, doesn't spend enough on defense, and has some issues, I think, speaking to the Nords and the Balts and the other countries that are. And then we have a country like Poland that I think has all the opportunity to lead, but really haven't taken up that mantle. So what I'm looking for in the conversations that are happening now between European leaders is a European leader really going to emerge that could cohere a common vision, because Europe actually is at the table because of all of the deep connections we have in the United States with the European Union, but they're not acting like it. And I think in this new world of transactionalism that we're in, the new world of geopolitical competition that we've been living in, if you don't fight for your seat at the table, you're going to get cut out. And that's exactly what's happening now. So my call to Europeans has always been, look, show up. What are you going to bring? What are you going to do? Like, what do you have? And yes, Europe plays an important role in the US ability to project hard power across the world. Europe hosts dozens of US bases, which are critical for operations and defense and deterrence in the Middle East and Africa. Most of those bases are not there to defend Europe. They're there to allow the US to project power in other parts of the world. So we are deeply, deeply integrated with our core allies, but they're not making that clear, I think, to the president. Most certainly, it seems that way to me. They're not making that case here in the United States, and they really need to.
All right, well, our audience has had their morning shot of informational espresso, so we'll leave it there and tackle the day. Let me thank Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Alina, thank you so much for swinging by today.
Thanks. Great to be here.
And a warm thank you to you, our members, for joining us today for this special episode of The Call. If you have any questions about today's topic, or if you have a theme you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us at the email on the screen, globalintel@uschamber.com. We are planning many shows in the coming weeks and months, and we welcome your suggestions and feedback. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.